So just one moment. I'll be right back. All right, thank you so much for your patience. We should be live on Facebook now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will introduce our speaker for this evening. So Dr. Leslie Poole is our speaker for this evening. She is a professor of environmental studies at Rollins College in Winter Park. She's an award-winning journalist and historian, and her work focuses on how women used grassroots actions in order to create change in the state and to protect its natural resources. Leslie is a fourth-generation Floridian and has lived in Winter Park for more than 3 decades, raising her family and engaging in a variety of community work. And her presentation this evening will center on the role of women in Florida's 20th century environmental movement. Women were saving birds, creating parks, improving forestry, and working to beautify cities even before they could vote. And I have seen a version of this presentation prior to this, and it was absolutely fascinating. So please go ahead, Dr. Poole. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's really a privilege to be here. Does it help if I say I'm a member of the Orange Audubon Society?
Oh, awesome.
Okay. I like the birds too. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that I can show you some of these really remarkable women that I've been researching and studying for a long time now. And I'm going to, let's see if I can get this up and you guys can all see it. Can you see that? I hope, yes, yay. Technology and I aren't always together, and I have to apologize. I am visiting my son and his new baby, so I'm in a bedroom in a bed and breakfast in Austin, Texas. So not as professional background as normal. I'm an environmental historian, and so I'm really interested in the kind of the genesis of the environmental movement in Florida. And when I went back to school very late in life to get my PhD, I decided I wanted to look at the role of women, and oh my gosh, the stories were everywhere. So I barely had to scratch the surface. So today I'm just going to give you a smattering of some of the different topics that I've looked at, and you may have stories of your own as well, but it's a really fascinating topic that's really kept me very engaged and interested for many years now. But before we start talking about what happened in the 20th century, we need to think about what was happening prior to that. And, you know, when the colonists came to North America and the first people came into Florida, what they saw was just a land of plenty. There were forests that they had never imagined. You know, Europe was very much, had been conquered and plowed. But when they came to North America, there were streams full of fish, birds that darkened the air with their passages. And so there was this belief that nothing, that was a land of plenty, it would never disappear. But by the late 1800s, it was clear that that was simply a myth. Some examples: by the late 1800s, bison were near extinction. There had been 60 million of them, but a few that were remnant in Yellowstone and in parks on the East Coast were all that was left of these amazing animals that were really a symbol of America and the wilderness. In 1914, you probably all know, the last passenger pigeon, Martha, died at the Cincinnati Zoo. There were once billions of these birds that would travel in packs or flocks, up to like a mile long and break branches of trees. And now the last one died. And a few years later, the last Carolina parakeet that were once found in Florida died as well in the Cincinnati Zoo. So this idea of extinction and that the resources could disappear lead to a movement of conservation. And the thinking behind that was for wise scientific use of resources, but also protection of species on the brink. And we see that really come to fruition in the later 20th century. But let's get started, first of all, with something that I think will interest you. It's mating season for the birds, right? The time of year when the snowy egrets put on their special plumes called egrets that get the girls happy and get the nesting going, which is a fabulous thing if you're a snowy egret, but it's not such a good thing if you're valued more highly in being a decoration for a woman's hat. And that's exactly the style that was happening in women's fashions in the late 1800s and early 20th century. It was a $17 million business in which birds, bird feathers, bird bodies were used to decorate ladies' fashions, and mostly hats, but also clothing. There were reports from different fashion magazines as well. And what it meant big money, but it also meant that hundreds of thousands of birds were being killed every year in order to supply this industry, an estimated 42 species of Florida birds. And it was women wearing the hats. And that gave rise to a lot of Audubon societies that were started by women who felt like it was their moral duty to do something about it. In Florida, that came in March. We're actually celebrating the anniversary a couple of weeks ago of the founding of Florida Audubon in Maitland, Florida. And the woman who organized that group was Clara Domrich. She was actually a German immigrant who lived in New York City, but wintered in Maitland every year. And this was her home. She and her husband, Louis, lived here. They made it a bird sanctuary and they loved Florida birds. But now when she came down for the winter, she discovered that the birds were in trouble. And so Clara decided she was going to do something about it. So on a March morning in 1900, she gathered together the who's who of Central Florida and invited them into her living room. And there they founded the Florida Audubon Society. And its initial mission was to educate the public, to get bird protection laws and stop this fashion trend. Sadly, Clara died just a few months later, so she never lived to see what the Florida Audubon Society would become, but she is very much credited with being the force that got it going. Among other women in the Audubon effort in Florida were two really remarkable Audubon members. Mary Barmonroe on the left helped found the Tropical Audubon Society she lived in Coconut Grove, and it was down in South Florida. This is the only known picture of Mary. She was known for not just advocating for Audubon societies, but also she would go into local restaurants and hotels. And if she saw women wearing hats that had bird plumes, she would just go after them verbally until we are told many women were left in tears and tearing apart their hats and swearing never to do that again. On the right is a petition that a group of women and school teachers and students put together in 1913 to save the robin. The third woman from the left is Catherine Bell Tippett, who is the founder of the St. Petersburg Audubon Society and its president for many, many years. Here, they're holding a 70-foot petition that they took up to Tallahassee in 1913. Now remember, they can't vote, but they managed to get a law passed by the legislature to save the robin. A lot of farmers and agricultural folks did not like robins. They thought that they were a pest and a nuisance and they wanted to get rid of them. And I also want to just point out, look how very sweet they look in these beautiful white outfits. They're not challenging, do they? They look like they'd just be very mild-mannered. But trust me, when the women went up to Tallahassee to get things done, the male legislature soon learned to just pass their agenda because the women were not going to go away. You may not know that Florida women created Florida's first state park. Again, 1916, before they could vote. This was located on Paradise Key, which was a rise in the land in the Everglades that had been long loved by botanists for its remarkable bird life, its orchids, its extraordinary plant life, and particularly the royal palms that were found there. there was a huge concern that road building projects might lead to the palms being removed from the area. And while the botanists and scientists had tried to get something done to protect the area, it wasn't until they teamed up with the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs that that actually was accomplished. And what happened is that the women's clubs that had a large membership across the state got a donation of land from Henry Flagler's widow. And then they went to Tallahassee and asked the state cabinet to match that amount of land to create Royal Palm State Park. It took a lot of lobbying and a lot of work, but in 1916, they were able to dedicate the park. It was the first park in the United States created by women's clubs, and it was celebrated across the nation for the accomplishment of these women. Interestingly, the legislature refused to fund the park, so the women did it themselves. They had fundraising campaigns, they approached everybody they knew, and they had some really strong connections. They even had a penny campaign just to raise money to fund the park. And on the right, you can see they actually built a lodge there to house VIP visitors and also scientists that they encouraged to come down and look at this area and study it for its value. I'll tell you a story, a really quick story. There's a funny story when, at one point when they were trying to get money from the legislature and the legislature was not wanting to fund it, eventually they did, the head of the women's clubs suggested that perhaps all the women in the women's clubs should let the men and their families know that if there was going to be no park, then there was going to be no pie for 2 years. I'll let you guess what the no pie meant, but it's an interesting, subtle, very feminine threat that they used in order to secure the park. I also want to let you know that the Florida State Park Service does not recognize Royal Palm as the first state park because the women held it. They never gave it to the state. They controlled it until it became the nucleus of Everglades National Park in 1947. And if you've ever been down to the Everglades, you may have gone on a very well-traveled path known as the Anhinga Trail. That is where Royal Palm was. That was the origin of it. And it's still very well-traveled today. It's almost a guarantee to see an alligator and lots of birds. And when the Everglades National Park was created in 1947, the women were lauded and recognized for their role in helping to, and they donated it to the effort, so they were recognized for their efforts to make that happen. The leader of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs who got Royal Palm Park taken care of was a Jacksonville resident, Maymann Jennings, who has been described as the most powerful woman in Florida, but I would argue she was one of the most politically powerful people, period, in the state of Florida. Maymann Jennings had many interests in Florida. As head of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, she again exerted her power at getting the park created. She also was very involved in efforts to try to improve forestry practices in the state of Florida. And she and her family owned some forestry land, so she had an innate interest in this. And when they were putting together the Florida Forestry Board, May was the only female member, but she was also tasked with creating the legislation to get the board created. Her husband had been governor of Florida, which gave her a lot of political cachet, but even after his death, she continued to be very powerful. So one of the things that May was very interested in, and also women's clubs were interested and garden clubs were interested in, was the forestry practices in the early 20th century. And if you look at the picture on the right, this is what you might expect after a logging crew had come through a longleaf pine community and logged the trees, maybe had done some turpentining as well, which damaged a lot of trees. They would cut and move on. Why? Because they could, because that was the practice. You didn't replant, there was just so much. It was endless. Longleaf pine once covered everything from Virginia to Lake Okeechobee to across the Mississippi River. This was the habitat in southeastern United States. And I offer you a picture of a healthy forest today on the left as well. Unfortunately, these pines were not replanted, and now we've lost 98% of these forests in the United States. It's a huge loss, and many of you may know there are some very species that are very dependent on these forests, including the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker. So what May and the forestry advocates wanted to have happen, and they really pressed for this, was to start having forests replanted. That was a better, wiser use. That would create forests going into the future, and this is what they advocated for. Another thing that May was heavily involved in was city beautification. And I'll offer you some photos so you see exactly why. Florida's early cities weren't necessarily beautiful, and many women's clubs were created simply to deal with the beauty, or I should say, lack of beauty in some of Florida's cities. They saw weeds and sandy roads and dusty areas and pigs and cattle roaming freely through the areas, and women weren't going to have it. In some instances, some women's clubs actually hired caretakers for the city. In others, they went out and planted bushes and trees and flowering plants in order to make their communities more beautiful. And this was a really central effort early on. And another effort that they started getting involved in the early 20th century was sign control. Because why plant beautiful trees if someone's gonna go put a sign on it? And this made them very crazy. And here's I just offer you this one picture. There was a woman who drove from Jacksonville to Miami who said that she saw hundreds of billboards along the way. And to many women's clubbers, and particularly I have to say the garden clubs really were involved in this. Not only was it ugly, but they saw it as a safety issue as well. If you're driving along and reading all these signs, that's not a good thing. And garden clubs to this day continue to be very involved in signage and billboard in Florida as well. Okay, let me see. And I want to mention this too, in Jacksonville, the Garden Club is very involved in beautification issues. And one of the places that you may be familiar with is Treaty Oak. They worked to get the oak tree saved in 1935 and donated it to the city in 1964. At that time, it was already estimated at over 2 centuries old. And it's a really remarkable tree. They also had a local campaign, Save the Trees and Make Jacksonville Green. Many of these campaigns were local, but some of them also were on a statewide level and even on a national level, that they would mimic each other and look at agendas and come up with similar campaigns for their communities as well. Okay. So you can't talk about women in Florida without talking about the 3 Marjories. This is one of my favorite things to talk about with my students. My first Marjorie, you may be familiar with, is Marjorie Carr Rollins. She was a writer who came to Florida in the 1920s with her husband and immediately fell in love with the rural hamlet of Cross Creek, which is literally between 2 lakes, between Ocala and Gainesville, near Micanopy. Rollins immediately fell in love with the landscape. It really affected her, and it became the setting for her most famous works, including the yearling that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1939. Now, Rollins wasn't an activist per se, but she's the person who really helped readers across the United States fall in love with rural Florida. And there was a time during World War II where Collier's magazine asked her to write an article about forestry practices. And she did. She wrote a piece pleading for better use of trees and replanting of forests, that she said they may be needed for the war effort, but they're also needed for Americans back home as well. And since she says, we all rely on trees to survive. She wrote to her husband later and said, you know, my books may never continue. I may not be remembered at all, but I might be remembered as the gal who helped save America's trees. I think she did a little bit better than that as well. Marjorie Harris Carr is our second Marjorie, who led the battle to stop the Cross Florida Barge Canal in the 1960s. Marjorie Carr loved the Ocklawaha River. It was a place of beauty. It restored her soul. And when she found out, actually from a woman from the Jacksonville Garden Club, called her and said, you heard about this project that's going to get started pretty soon? And Carr had no idea. It was going to, part of its path was going to take out the Ocklawaha River. It was going to use that water in order to create a path across the state to connect the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico for barge traffic. by the time Carr got involved, and she got the Alachua Audubon Society involved as well early on, they discovered that it had already been approved by Congress. The funding was already there, and it looked like is all on with the Army Corps of Engineers. But Carr was not going to have it, and she helped create a grassroots group. It was really the first big grassroots environmental battle in the state of Florida, and they decided, first of all, they asked the Army Corps of Engineers simply to change the route and stay away from the Ocklawaha. When the Army Corps refused and ignored her and kind of brushed her off and treated her like, this little housewife, when actually she had a master's degree in zoology, Carr and her group that eventually called themselves the Florida Defenders of the Environment went to work, and they created an incredible campaign that ultimately led to President Richard Nixon stopping the Barge Canal in 1971. It was the first time a major federal public works project had been stopped so far along in the process. More than $70 million sunk into it. Carr died, and her last campaign was to get rid of a dam that had been built in the Palatka area and restore the Ocklawaha River to a free-flowing stream. She never lived to see that, and the Florida Defenders of the Environment continue today to try to get that. It's all been deauthorized, but they need the restoration, they need the removal of the dam, which, by the way, apparently has outlived its time period, and there's a big campaign afoot right now because there's concerns that the dam might actually fail as well. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is the Marjorie most everybody knows, the patron saint of the Everglades. And she wrote the book Everglades River of Grass that really taught us how to understand the Everglades as a sheet flow of water that really starts near Orlando and moves all the way to the southern tip of Florida. But what you may not know is that she really was not an activist till very late in life. She had run into a woman one night at a grocery store, and a woman was working as an activist to try to stop a proposed jet port in the Big Cypress. And Marjorie said to the woman, "Good for you, keep up the battle." And the woman turned on her and said, "Yeah, well, what are you doing?" And Douglas said, "Well, I wrote the book." And the young woman said, "You know what, that's just not enough." So in her autobiography, Douglas says, "I told her, well, I'll do whatever I can." And the next day, activists were on her doorstep. And eventually Douglas created the Friends of the Everglades, which was a grassroots group. Again, costs you $1 a year to be a member, but they became an advocacy group to try to prevent projects that might damage the Everglades, and ultimately now are involved in Everglades restoration efforts. I use Douglas in talking to groups and in talking to my students because I think she's an incredible example of the power of one person to make a difference, a very determined, good communicator person, but who can also rally the troops. But she's also an example of it is never too old to get involved. And when you get involved at age 79, but if you live to be 108, you can get a lot done. And indeed she did. And whenever she would go to hearings, developers would quake in their shoes, worried about what she was going to say. And one of the things she said was, they can't be mean to me because I'm a little old lady in tennis shoes, but I can certainly be rude to them. And she would let them have it. By the middle of the 20th century, air and water pollution become issues in Florida that many people never thought they would ever see. But it was due to a huge booming population and urbanization in the state as well. And it wasn't just in Florida, it was happening across the United States. One of the groups that got engaged early on in national issues and promoting, better and cleaner air and water was the League of Women Voters. This was an issue they took on and had a lot of different hearings in different states trying to promote better use of that as well. Women did not believe that this kind of pollution should be the cost of doing business, that if you want a good economy, you have to have dirty air and dirty water. They refused. They protested utility plants in Jacksonville, where one day women reported their stockings melted off their legs because of the air pollution. They protested phosphate plants in Polk County that one woman said was giving her husband asthma. And this is not what they moved to Florida for. They also protested sewage plants that were dumping raw sewage into rivers and lakes and just offshore as well. The idea being, oh, well, dilution is the solution to pollution, but it wasn't, because eventually it accumulates enough and it does create enormous problems as well. So this brings a lot of women to get involved in these kinds of issues as well. Endangered species brought a lot of women into the environmental movement, particularly starting in the 1960s and on. And I have two examples here for you of species that we're still worried about. In 1995, Shirley Reynolds and Rita Alexander, who lived in New Smyrna Beach, became incredibly concerned about the fate of baby sea turtles. Because at night, when they typically hatch, they follow the moon to the sea. But unfortunately, at the time, condos and lights from streets were making the turtles go the wrong way, and they were getting killed in traffic. These were endangered species. And when the women pled to the local county to do something about it, they were ignored and brushed off. They were told, no, it would hurt business. They sued in federal court using the Endangered Species Act, and a federal judge ruled in their favor. And now, as a result, all of us now have gotten used to turning off your lights or pulling down your shades at night on the coast, so that we can all protect these species during the season where they are hatching. Manatees also bring women into the environmental movement. Judith Valley was standing outside her house looking at the new river in Fort Lauderdale back in the 70s. When she's noticed boats were traveling really fast up and down the river, and she was quite concerned because she knew there were manatees there. When she went to a local governmental board and asked them if they could maybe institute speed limits, she was poo-pooed, and one man suggested that she just get a box of rotten tomatoes and just throw them at the boaters as they came by. Well, that was not something you want to say to Judith, and she went on to work through the Florida Audubon Society and create the Save the Manatee Club, which is no longer with the Florida Audubon Society, but is an incredibly successful nonprofit organization that has come up with some really remarkable campaigns. Save the Manatee campaign, which was suggested by Jimmy Buffett. They've adopted it, and now it's become a really popular campaign. So this is something that brings women in as well. Environmental justice also is an area that gets women engaged, because what we have learned time and time again in Florida and across the United States is when there is a degraded or bad environment, the people who are hurt the most are minorities, the poor, the powerless, because they can't up and move. They may be working in that industry that's creating the problems as well. And many women got involved as activists for social reasons. This is the social side of environmental issues. Joy Told Ezel has been working for over 30 years to try to clean up the Finn Holloway River, which is over near Perry on the Gulf Coast. It was once a river that was used for bottling water, and people came to the springs along the river for health reasons. But in the 1940s, in an effort to bring more industry into Perry, the Florida state legislature designated the Finn Holloway River as an industrial river, which meant that the anticipated pulp mill could dump anything into the river that it liked. And the same thing happened in the Jacksonville area on the Amelia River. And I'm not sure the name of the power plant, but and pulp mill, but the same thing happened there. These were two rivers that were that the legislature decided they were willing to sacrifice to industry. Well, Joy grew up there. Her family has multi-generations there. And when she started looking into it, she realized there were some really dangerous chemicals going into the river, including dioxin, which is considered one of the most dangerous cancer-causing chemicals out there. So for over 30 years, Joy has been fighting to clean up the Finn Holloway River. The legislature has told the pulp mill that it had to clean up the river, and just recently, the pulp mill has completed what it says will be the project to save the river. And basically, it's going to send its effluent through a pipeline all the way into the Gulf of Mexico. And then that way, it won't pollute the river anymore, but it'll still pollute the Gulf of Mexico. And there is already a dead zone now where the Finn Holloway River comes out into the Gulf of Mexico. Nevertheless, Joy Joy powers on, and to me, she's a real hero. Jeannie Economos has been working with Lake Apopka farm workers, again, for over 30 years. You may be familiar with Lake Apopka, which is the site of a huge restoration project. Back in the 1990s, I believe, there was a huge die-off of birds that had used that area for fishing, and they discovered there were many toxic chemicals that had remained in the soil of this restoration area. And so we know that there were a lot of really dangerous chemicals that had been used there. What Jeannie is worried about is that we've spent a lot of time looking at the birds there, studying the alligators, which have reproductive problems, but no one has spent any large scale amount of money looking at the impact on the health of the farm workers who worked there. And now there's multi-generations within that group that have suffered from miscarriages, cancer, autoimmune system diseases as well. But she powers on trying to get some justice for those folks. By the end of the 20th century, Florida women have many new opportunities. Well, women across the United States. We get to vote now, unlike Clara Domrich. We get to be members of organizations that include men and women. And most environmental groups have moved toward the very specific targets. So cleaning up the Everglades or saving the Ocklawaha, those were very specific campaigns. But at the same time, there's a growing bureaucracy within the federal government and in the state government into which women finally were allowed to engage. And I offer you three very different examples here. Mary Grizzle was the mother of 6, and she started out as a St. Petersburg PTA president, but soon got involved in Republican women activities. And in 1963, she was elected to the Florida State House of Representatives, where she earned a reputation for her environmental stances, notably a 1972 law that set tough standards for treatment of sewage that was being dumped into Tampa Bay. So here's a woman who not only had the power to vote, but she could enact legislation that women early in the century only had to ask men to do. Victoria Schinkel applied for a state job in 1974, and during her interview, she was asked about her marriage, her plans to have children, her husband's job, very discriminatory questions that you're not allowed to ask anymore. But she wasn't daunted, and by the age of 33, she became head of the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation, which was the largest environmental bureaucracy in the state of Florida, and in a new and a really rapidly developing field. She is no longer with that agency, but now is very involved in the 1,000 Friends of Florida, working to push for better growth management in the state of Florida as well. And finally, probably no woman represents the vast change in environmental opportunities in the 20th century than Carol Browner. Carol grew up in Miami. She became an attorney and worked in Tallahassee with governors, and then eventually ended up as perhaps the most important environmental role in the nation as the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, probably the largest environmental bureaucracy in the world. She served in that capacity from 1993 to 2001 and led a number of initiatives, including the handling of hazardous waste sites, and often emphasized her role as a mother when describing the urgency and necessity of creating a safe, healthy environment for everyone. She was laughed at by a lot of male politicians for, associating herself as a mother. But I think people really got that. She said, I'm worried about future generations. And a lot of the women that I have encountered in my research happily take on that role as a mother. As a matter of fact, sometimes that's what propelled them into the movement in the first place, worrying about their children, their family's health, and the future as well. So when we're thinking about the range of women's roles in the 20th century, we can start with Clara Domrich's living room, and we can finish up with Carol Browner's desk at the EPA and now beyond. Many of these women were everyday women, mothers, employees, club women, but they changed the course of Florida history by demanding change. And they did it in many ways. They did it through grassroots work, through petitions, through working together to create power. And they use their credentials as mothers and wives as in the same way in their passionate work. And as I look at them, I really feel like I'm the heir to their work, and that we are all the inheritors of all this work that these women started. And I'm just so happy to be able to tell their stories. And again, I live in awe of all the work they've been done. I've written about them in my book, and this is the name of it, Saving Florida. And I also have a new book out that I think you wanted me to mention. This just came out last month, an edited collection that I've done with Jack Davis from the University of Florida. And it's a series of essays by different writers talking about places in Florida that inspire them. That's available at Amazon, University Press of Florida, or, I always like ordering them from your local bookstore if you're interested. So I'm continuing to look at Florida. I'm continuing to look at how different people, relate to the environment. And I really think that sometimes we have to get people to love it in order to care about it. And that's really the purpose of this new book that's out as well. So with that, I will conclude and we can go back to our meeting.
Well, gosh, Leslie, that was absolutely fascinating. I enjoyed it as much this time as I did the last time I heard you speak. So interesting. Does anyone have any questions for Leslie about the topic this evening? You can either post it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. There's not that many of us here tonight, so you can unmute yourself and just ask whatever you prefer. I'm getting some really nice comments, Leslie, in the chat. You may be seeing them. I'm not sure.
I can't see it.
You can't see. I think they're coming to me, but
Okay.
Teresa says it's amazing, and Sue says it's inspiring, which I totally agree. Anyone have any questions?
Carol, I do. I have one. Leslie, welcome. We appreciate your all your information. It was really great. I assume in other states there's other women doing kind of the same things. I mean, you highlighted Florida, but I assume there's tons of this going on all over the place that really doesn't have a voice for people to educate the rest of us on how prevalent it is that women are involved in all of this.
I can pretty much guarantee you that is happening. And the reason I say that is because there were women's clubs and garden clubs, which are largely female, and League of Women Voters in every state and locally, just like you guys, just like the Audubon Society is built, right? Local, state, national, and they talked to each other. They would share agendas, they would share projects. When the women's clubs created the state park in Florida, the president of the National Women's Clubs came down. I mean, they made it a big deal. And so they were talking to each other and talking about what they thought was important. Most of the early women's clubs had committees on birds and a committee on beautification and committee on forestry. So I think they would have different issues that they were approaching. We have the Everglades, no one else has that. But I think that the activism would have been very similar. I think, and all I had to do was start scratching the surface, and I found so much material. It's been really fascinating. And I do believe that you could probably do a book just like this for just about every state.
Very true.
How did you get interested in this topic to begin with?
Well, in my first life, and I've had several, I was a newspaper reporter, and I used to do a lot of writing about the environment. And I always noticed that in those groups, the men were usually the presidents, but the women were the worker bees who did a lot of the work. And so I had met Marjorie Carr during my working on my master's degree, and she was just such a remarkable and striking person. So when I started off doing my PhD in history, I started off actually, my first idea was to go take a look at the Florida Audubon Society, which is in my backyard. I live in Winter Park, and their archives are in Maitland. So I went over there and started digging through their papers, and it was immediately apparent. They always had a male president, but in their handwritten minutes for the first 20 years or 10 years, the women were doing everything. The women were the treasurer, the secretary, the publicity person. I mean, they were just super involved, but they just hadn't been given the credit. So that's kind of when I was starting to kind of like dig into what the activism was. And then when I went to the garden clubs and started reading what they were doing, and then I went to the women's club, I mean, it was just a wealth of material. So, you know, trial and error, but a lot of info.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. Great.
Anyone else have any additional questions? Kate, go ahead.
I had two comments that are related to the things that women do. I'm with the Native Plant Society, and we have a park down Riverside called Native Park. It was actually founded by a women's garden club in the 1920s to promote the use of native plants. So again, it was women getting together. The other thing is that I just had a meeting, what day is it? It was today, with the Riverfront Parks Now group. That was yesterday. But anyway, it's a group that are interested in having a plan for the Jacksonville waterfront with the land that is public land right now. I have a plan for a park system rather than just sort of haphazard development. And what struck me as I was listening to the two founders talk was it was women. And I'm sure there are many other people involved in the group now, but women that were looking at our waterfront and things, potentially it's going to just all be cement or better things that we can do with it. So it's just another example of women as activists, and I put the link in the chat if anyone's interested.
Great. I mean, that's true. And I didn't even touch on it, but women were very involved in all kinds of local parks. Sometimes they donated their own land to create a park. They also were advocates for city planning. They tried to convince our city commissions to bring in planners. Let's look at how this development is going. In Winter Park, where I live, they got the city commission to start collecting garbage. They also got the first tree ordinance in Winter Park, and they pushed for it becoming a bird sanctuary. I mean, so there's a lot of things that are kind of, you have to go digging through it to find it. Again, the men are doing the enacting in the early part of the 20th century. But you know, they you know what they say, give a busy woman, if you want something done, give it to a busy woman, because she'll get it taken care of for you. And I don't discount the men, because certainly the women had to engage the men to agree with them to enact the laws, right, in the city commissions and the legislature. They had to convince a lot of men, and a lot of men were already in agreement on these issues. But this is, you know, a way that they found some political power that theoretically we keep thinking they didn't have.
Anyone else have any questions for Leslie? I'm posting some links in the chat. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
I had to
go ahead,
unmute
Teresa.
myself.
No worries.
I have a question regarding to who is in charge of the Royal Palm State Park? I know that you may have already briefly discussed a little bit about that, but I know that if the women were taken over, and they didn't release it, is it part of like the national parks? Are you able to go in there? And then my second question is, will all of this information be in your new book that you just shared? Because I would love to just review this over and over, and there was just a wealth of information. I just loved it.
Well, thank you. So Royal Palm State Park became part of Everglades National Park. And so it no longer exists. But if you go into Everglades National Park and you go down to the Anhinga Trail, which is a big boardwalk area, that's where it was originally founded. And in 2016, they had a big event, and I spoke about, you know, the 100th anniversary of the first state park. And so Everglades National Park is very aware of that and very celebratory for that. A lot of this information and a lot more is in my Saving Florida book that is still available through Amazon and the University Press of Florida. And I'm sure you can order it through your local bookstore too. And there's so many more stories in there. And I tried to, you know, tell these women's stories to give them credit. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you so very much. Anybody else have a question for Leslie before we close the meeting? If not, thank you so much, Dr. Poole. I should be calling you Dr. Poole. we certainly appreciate you addressing us this evening. It was absolutely fascinating, and thanks for taking the time out, because I know you were visiting family. So we certainly appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this evening.
Oh, can you tell? I will talk about this anytime. So
Well,
thank you.
it's an amazing topic. It's like stuff that you don't even know. So, you know, it's a history that needs to be shared way more frequently. So thank you for all of your efforts in doing that. So
Thank you.
well, all right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting. Everyone is saying how much they've enjoyed it, and we certainly appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming tonight, and I'll say good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.